Her ribs were still healing when she whispered 5 words to a stranger in a diner booth. "My son did this." Then she begged him to forget she'd said it. He couldn't. What she didn't know was that the biker sitting across from her belonged to a brotherhood 400 strong, men the whole town feared and misjudged in equal measure. Within weeks, her quiet street would fill with the sound of engines she never expected to hear again. Her son thought no one was watching. He thought wrong. What happened next would change everything she believed about strangers, about family, and about who actually shows up when everything else has gone silent. The first frost of October had settled over Greene County by the time Robert Mitchell pulled his Harley into the gravel lot of the Crossroads Diner, just off Route 60, outside Springfield, Missouri. The engine ticked as it cooled, and he sat for a moment, letting the chill bite through his leather jacket, watching his breath fog in the morning air. 52 years old, grey creeping into his beard, Robert had ridden this stretch of highway more times than he could count. It was part of his Sunday routine, a ritual he'd kept since his wife passed 3 years back. Coffee, eggs, and 45 minutes of silence before the noise of the world caught up with him again. The diner smelled like bacon grease and burnt coffee, the kind of place that hadn't changed its menu or its booths since the Reagan administration. Robert took his usual seat by the window, nodding at the waitress, a heavy-set woman named Doris, who'd been slinging plates there longer than he'd been riding. He didn't need to order. She already knew. It was the woman in the corner booth who caught his attention. She sat alone, a cup of tea going cold in front of her, untouched. Small and frail, she couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds, soaking wet, with thin white hair pulled back into a loose bun and hands that trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. Robert guessed her age somewhere in the 70s. What struck him wasn't her frailty. It was the way she held herself, stiff and careful, like every breath cost her something. He'd seen that kind of posture before, in men who'd taken a beating and were trying not to show it. He watched her wince as she shifted in the booth, one hand pressing lightly against her ribs before she caught herself and folded her hands back in her lap, as though the pain was something to be ashamed of. Robert wasn't the type to pry. 30 years riding with the Iron Watch Motorcycle Club had taught him plenty about minding his own business, about respecting a person's right to carry their burdens without a stranger's interference. But something about the old woman's eyes, when they briefly met his, stopped him cold. There was fear in them. Not the vague unease of a stranger in a diner, but something deeper, something practiced. The fear of a person who had learned to expect pain and had simply stopped waiting for it to end. Doris arrived with his coffee. "That's Barbara Whitfield," she said quietly, following his gaze. "Comes in most Sundays. Sweet woman. Husband passed some years back. Cancer, I think. Lives alone out on Miller Road now." "She always looked like that?" Robert asked. Doris's mouth tightened. "Been coming in more banged up lately, if you want my honest opinion. Says she's clumsy. Falls a lot." She shrugged, the practiced shrug of someone who'd decided a long time ago that it wasn't her place to ask more questions. "Not my business, though." Robert said nothing, but he kept watching. When Barbara finally rose to leave, she moved slowly, one hand braced against the booth, and as she passed his table she stumbled slightly. Robert reached out instinctively to steady her elbow, and she gasped. Not from surprise, but from pain, a sharp intake of breath that told him more than any words could have. "I'm sorry," Robert said, releasing her arm immediately. "Didn't mean to startle you." Barbara straightened, forcing a thin smile onto a face that had once, he suspected, been quite lovely. No, it's fine. I'm just a clumsy old woman." Her eyes flicked toward the window, toward the parking lot, toward anywhere but his face. "You sure you're all right, ma'am?" Robert kept his voice low, gentle, the same tone he used with skittish dogs and frightened kids at the charity rides his club organized every summer. For a moment, something shifted in Barbara's expression. Her guard slipped, just barely, just long enough for Robert to see the exhaustion underneath, the years of carrying something too heavy for her thin shoulders. She glanced around the diner, checking, he realized later, to see if anyone was listening, if anyone was watching, if it was safe. Then she leaned in, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender soap beneath something sharper, something like fear. "My son did this," she whispered. The words landed like a dropped plate, sharp and final. Before Robert could respond, before he could even process what she'd said, Barbara straightened up again, the mask sliding back into place. "I didn't say that," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "Please, forget I said anything. I need to go." She was gone before Robert could stand, moving with surprising speed for a woman who'd been wincing in pain moments before, out the door and into a faded blue sedan parked at the edge of the lot. Robert watched through the window as she fumbled with her keys, hands shaking, and pulled out onto Route 60 without looking back. He sat back down slowly, his coffee forgotten, her whispered words echoing in his head. "My son did this." Robert Mitchell had built a life around a code, the unwritten rules that said you looked out for the vulnerable, you didn't turn your back on someone who needed help, even a stranger who'd just told you to forget what she'd said. Especially then. He thought about the small, sharp gasp Barbara Whitfield had made when he'd merely touched her elbow, and how many different lies a body could be made to tell when the truth was too dangerous to speak aloud. Doris came by to refill his coffee, glancing at the door Barbara had just fled through. "Everything okay?" Robert didn't answer right away. He was still staring at the empty booth, at the untouched cup of tea going colder by the second. "Doris," he said finally, "how well do you know that Miller Road out past the water tower?" Something in his voice made her set the coffee pot down. "Well enough. Why?" Robert Mitchell finished his coffee in one long swallow, dropped a 20 on the table, and stood up. Whatever his Sunday had been planned for, it wasn't anymore. "Just curious," he said. But as he walked out into the cold October morning and swung his leg over his bike, he already knew that curiosity wasn't what was pulling him toward Miller Road. It was something older than that, something that had nothing to do with strangers and everything to do with the kind of man he'd promised himself he'd be. Robert didn't go to Miller Road that Sunday. Instead, he did what 30 years in the Iron Watch Motorcycle Club had taught him to do first. He asked questions quietly, patiently, the way a man builds a case before he builds a plan. He started with Doris, who gave him more than she probably meant to. Barbara Whitfield had lived on Miller Road for over 40 years, first with her husband Harold, a retired postal worker who died of pancreatic cancer 6 years back, and more recently alone, save for occasional visits from her son, Kevin. According to Doris, Kevin had moved back into the area about 18 months ago after some trouble up in Kansas City. A failed business, a messy divorce, and if the rumors were to be believed, a drinking problem that hadn't improved with age. "He stays with her sometimes," Doris said, wiping down the counter with more force than necessary. "Comes and goes. Never seems to have 2 nickels to rub together, though Lord knows, Barbara's got that house paid off free and clear and a decent pension from Harold's years at the post office." It wasn't proof of anything. Robert knew that. Financial desperation didn't automatically mean violence, and a son's presence in his mother's home wasn't evidence of a crime. But it was a thread, and Robert Mitchell had never been the kind of man to leave a thread dangling once he'd noticed it. He brought what he'd learned to the clubhouse that Tuesday night during the regular meeting of the Iron Watch chapter. The clubhouse was a converted warehouse on the edge of town, walls lined with photographs from 40 years of charity rides, veteran fundraisers, and toy drives for kids who'd otherwise have gone without a Christmas. The Iron Watch wasn't the outlaw stereotype people saw in movies. Most of its 200 local members were veterans, tradesmen, retired cops, men who'd found in the Brotherhood of the Road something the rest of the world had stopped offering them. But Robert also knew how the club looked to outsiders: leather, tattoos, the low growl of engines. He knew what people assumed, and he knew how wrong they usually were. "So, a woman you don't know whispered something to you in a diner and now you want us involved?" Marcus Doyle asked, not unkindly. Marcus had been Robert's closest friend since they'd both come home from Fort Leonard Wood over 2 decades ago, and he had a way of asking the hard questions that Robert appreciated even when he didn't want to hear them. "I want us to look into it," Robert said. "That's all," quietly. "No confrontations, no assumptions. If I'm wrong, and we walk away. And if you're right?" Robert didn't have an answer for that yet. But the room had gone quiet in a way that told him the other members were already thinking it through. Men who'd raised daughters, buried parents, watched their own mothers grow small and fragile with age. Nobody in that room needed it. Explain to them what it meant for an old woman to whisper, "My son did this to a stranger," and then beg him to forget she'd said it. The following Thursday, Robert drove out to Miller Road, not on his bike, which tended to draw attention, but in his old pickup truck, dressed down in a flannel shirt instead of his cut. He told himself he was just going to look, to get a sense of the property of the neighborhood. He ended up parked across from a small, tidy ranch house with peeling white paint and an overgrown flower bed that had clearly once been someone's pride and joy. That was where he met Diane Foster. She was working in her own front yard, 2 houses down, and she watched him with the wary eyes of a woman who'd lived long enough in a small town to know when a stranger was up to something. When Robert approached and asked carefully about her neighbor, Diane's expression shifted from suspicion to something more complicated. Relief, maybe, or the exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying a worry alone for too long. "Barbara's a good woman," Diane said, glancing back toward the ranch house as though afraid of being overheard. "We used to have coffee every Wednesday before Harold passed. Haven't done that in months now." She hesitated. "Ever since Kevin moved back." "You've noticed something," Robert said. It wasn't a question. Diane's hands twisted in the fabric of her gardening apron. "I hear things sometimes. Yelling, late at night. And Barbara, she used to come to church every Sunday, rain or shine, and now she barely leaves the house, except for that diner. When I do see her, she's got bruises she explains away. A fall here, a bump there." Diane's voice dropped lower. "I called the county once, Adult Protective Services. They came out, talked to her, and she told them everything was fine. Said she loved her son, said he was just going through a hard time. What was I supposed to do after that? She's a grown woman. I can't force her to leave her own house." Robert felt something tighten in his chest, the particular useless frustration of watching a system built to protect people fail to do exactly that, because the person it was meant to protect was too afraid, too loyal, or too ashamed to accept the help being offered. "Does he hurt her?" Robert asked directly. Diane's silence was answer enough. "I don't know for certain," she finally said. "I've never seen it happen. But I know what I hear, and I know what I see the next day, and I know Barbara Whitfield was never a clumsy woman in the 40 years I've lived beside her." Robert thanked her and walked back to his truck, but before he could climb in, a beat-up sedan roared into the driveway of Barbara's house, gravel spraying beneath its tires. A man got out, mid-40s, heavy-set, wearing a wrinkled shirt that suggested he'd slept in it, moving with the loose, careless energy of someone who either didn't care who was watching or had never learned to. Kevin Whitfield. Robert watched from across the street as Kevin banged through the front door without knocking, without pausing, the way a man moves through a space he considers entirely his own. A few moments later, raised voices drifted across the yard, not words Robert could make out clearly, but the unmistakable rhythm of anger, followed by a sound that made every muscle in Robert's body go rigid. A woman's cry, short and sharp, quickly muffled. Diane had gone still beside her flower bed, her face pale. Robert's hand was already on his truck door before he made himself stop. 30 years of discipline, military training that had never fully left him, decades of learning when to act and when to wait, held him in place. Barging in now, a stranger, uninvited, with no evidence beyond a whispered confession and a muffled cry, could make everything worse. It could get Barbara hurt further once he was gone. It could get him arrested. It could give Kevin exactly the excuse he needed to isolate his mother even further. But he wasn't leaving either. Robert climbed into his truck and did not drive away. He sat there, engine off, watching the house, and he took out his phone and began to type a message to Marcus. "I found her. It's real. We need a plan." Across the street, in a house that had once held Sunday dinners and a marriage of 40 years, Barbara Whitfield pressed a dish towel to her split lip and listened to her son's footsteps pace the kitchen floor. And she prayed, as she had so many times before, that this time would be the last time, even though some small, exhausted part of her no longer believed that prayer would be answered. The plan, as it turned out, was harder to build than Robert had expected. He returned to the clubhouse that Thursday night with what he'd witnessed, and the room's mood shifted from cautious interest to genuine alarm. But alarm didn't translate easily into action. Marcus, ever the voice of caution, laid out the problem plainly. "We can't just show up at her door," he said. "Legally, we've got nothing. No police report, no witness willing to testify, no injury that's been documented by anyone official. Far as the law's concerned, Kevin Whitfield hasn't done a thing." Diane hears the yelling, "Hearsay!" And she already called APS once, and Barbara denied everything to their faces. Marcus rubbed a hand over his tired eyes. "I want to help this woman, Robert. I do. But we ride up there with 200 bikes and start making accusations. Best case, we scare Kevin into laying low for a month before it starts right back up. Worst case, we get accused of harassment, or Barbara gets caught in the middle, and it makes things worse for her at home." Robert knew he was right, and the knowledge sat like a stone in his stomach. He'd spent his whole life believing that seeing a wrong clearly was most of the battle, that once you knew the truth, the path forward became obvious. But here was a truth he could see plainly, and still he had no clean way to act on it. He tried the official channels first. He called Adult Protective Services himself, gave a statement about what he'd witnessed. The caseworker on the phone was sympathetic, but limited by the same constraints Marcus had described. Without Barbara's cooperation, without documented evidence, there was only so much the agency could do. A follow-up visit was scheduled. Robert had no way of knowing whether it would change anything. He tried speaking with Officer Grant Sullivan, a Springfield PD patrolman who occasionally showed up at the Iron Watch's charity events and had, over the years, become something like a friend. Grant listened carefully, jotted notes, but was honest about the limitations. "Elder abuse cases are some of the hardest things I deal with," Grant admitted, leaning against his cruiser outside the diner where they'd agreed to meet. "Half the time the victim won't press charges. They love their kid, or they're scared of being alone, or they're scared of what happens to the family if the son goes to jail. We can't force her to testify against her own will, Robert. My hands are tied unless something happens that we can actually act on. A real injury, reported at the time, with her willing to say who caused it. So we wait for her to get hurt badly enough that she has no choice but to admit it?" Grant's jaw tightened. "I don't like it any more than you do, but that's the law." Robert drove home that night with a bitterness he hadn't tasted in years. The particular helplessness of seeing danger clearly and being told again and again that his hands were tied until the danger became undeniable. He thought about walking away. He told himself he'd done what he could, that he'd tried the official channels, that Barbara Whitfield was a grown woman entitled to make her own choices, however incomprehensible those choices seemed from the outside. He almost believed it until he drove past the Crossroads Diner 2 Sundays later and saw Barbara's usual booth empty. Doris confirmed what he feared. "Haven't seen her in 2 weeks. Not like her to miss a Sunday." Her voice was tight with worry she'd clearly been carrying alone. "I called the house. No answer. Called again yesterday. Nothing." That was enough to send Robert back to Miller Road, official channels or not. He found Diane Foster in her yard again, and her face, when she saw him, was drawn with an anxiety that told him something had changed. "She won't come to the door," Diane said. "I've tried twice this week. I hear her moving around in there sometimes. The television, footsteps, so I know she's alive, but she won't answer, and Kevin's car has been parked in that driveway for 10 days straight." Robert felt the cold certainty settle into his chest, the kind of certainty that came not from evidence, but from years of reading people, of understanding the particular silence that surrounds a person who has been made to disappear a little at a time. Barbara Whitfield wasn't just being abused, she was being isolated, cut off from the diner, from her neighbor, from anyone who might notice the pattern and intervene. He stood on that quiet street, in the thin grey light of a Missouri autumn afternoon, and felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Doubt. Not doubt about whether Barbara needed help, that certainty had never wavered, but doubt about himself, about whether a 52-year-old biker with a leather jacket and a rough reputation was the right person to save her. He thought about how people looked at him and his club, the assumptions they made before they knew anything about who he actually was. He thought about how easily this could go wrong, how easily he could become, in the eyes of the law, just another intimidating stranger circling a vulnerable old woman's house. For the first time since that Sunday in the diner, Robert Mitchell considered walking away for good. He drove home in silence, and that night he sat alone in his garage, long after the sun had set, staring at a photograph of his late wife pinned above his workbench, the way he sometimes did when a decision felt too heavy to carry by himself. "What would you do?" he asked her silently. He already knew the answer. Ellen Mitchell had spent 30 years as an emergency room nurse. She had never once, in all those years, let a patient's fear stop her from doing what needed to be done. She had simply learned to be patient enough and gentle enough and stubborn enough to wait for the moment when help could finally be accepted. Robert picked up his phone and called Marcus. "I'm not walking away," he said. "But I need help doing this right, legally right, all the way right, so nobody can say we did anything but stand beside her." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Marcus, who had never once in 20 years let Robert walk into a fight alone, said simply, "Then let's figure out how to get her the proof she needs, and the courage to use it." It wasn't a plan yet, but it was the beginning of one. And for the first time in weeks, Robert Mitchell felt the stone in his stomach ease, just slightly, replaced by something steadier, the old familiar resolve of a man who had decided, once and for all, which side of the fight he was standing on. The break came, unexpectedly, through Karen Ellis. Karen was a nurse at Cox Medical Center South, and she happened to be married to one of the younger members of the Iron Watch. When Marcus put out a quiet word among the club about needing information on any recent emergency room visits connected to Barbara Whitfield, it was Karen who came back 3 days later with the piece they'd been missing. "I can't share medical records, obviously. That's a serious violation, and I won't do it," Karen told Robert and Marcus over coffee at the clubhouse. "But I can tell you this much, because it's already documented, and it's a matter that involves a mandatory reporting situation I flagged myself. A Barbara Whitfield came into the ER 6 weeks ago with 2 fractured ribs. Said she fell down the porch steps." Karen's expression made clear exactly how much she believed that explanation. The attending physician documented the injury pattern as inconsistent with a simple fall. "I filed a report with Adult Protective Services myself, as required by law. I don't know what came of it." Robert felt something settle into place, cold and clear. 2 fractured ribs, the wincing in the diner booth. My son did this. It was the first piece of documented official evidence they had. Not hearsay, not suspicion, but a medical record already on file with the exact agency that had the authority to act. That report should have triggered a full investigation, Marcus said. Should have, Karen agreed. But you know how backlogged that system is, and if Barbara told the caseworker who followed up that everything was fine, same as last time, the case likely got closed without further action. It happens more than anyone wants to admit. Robert made a decision that night that would shape everything that followed. He wasn't going to wait for the system to work on its own timeline. He was going to build a bridge between what the system needed, documented, willing testimony, and what Barbara Whitfield was too afraid to give on her own. And he was going to do it by showing her, undeniably, that she would not be standing alone when she finally did. The Iron Watch Motorcycle Club had chapters across 4 counties in southern Missouri, close to 400 members total when you counted every charter. Robert had never once in 30 years called on that full number for anything but the largest charity rides. He called on it now. Word went out quietly, deliberately, through every chapter. A woman on Miller Road needed protection, and the club was going to make sure that when she was finally ready to ask for help, 400 riders would already be standing behind her. It took 2 more weeks of careful, patient work. Marcus coordinated with Officer Grant Sullivan to ensure everything the club did stayed inside the law. No trespassing, no direct confrontation, nothing that could be construed as vigilante justice. Diane Foster agreed to keep a written log of everything she witnessed or heard, dated and detailed, the kind of documentation that would hold up if it were ever needed in court. Robert himself began stopping by the Crossroads Diner every single Sunday, sitting in the same booth, ordering the same coffee, waiting. Barbara finally returned on the 4th Sunday, thinner than before, moving even more carefully, but there. Robert didn't rush her. He simply asked quietly if he could sit with her for a few minutes. And when she nodded, he told her, gently, honestly, everything he knew, the hospital report, Diane's log, the fact that Adult Protective Services already had a file with her name on it, and then he told her about the club, not as an intimidation, not as a threat against her son, but as a promise. You don't have to do this alone anymore, Robert said. You've got 400 people who don't even know your name yet, who are ready to stand beside you the moment you're ready to stand up. All you have to do is say the word, and we'll be there. Every step. The police, the courts, moving your things if you need to leave, all of it. You just have to say the word. Barbara Whitfield sat very still for a long moment, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had, for once, not gone cold. When she finally looked up at him, there were tears in her eyes, but for the first time since Robert had met her, there was also something else, the faintest flicker of resolve. He's my son, she whispered. I raised him. I remember when he was small, when he'd fall asleep on my chest, and I'd think there was nothing in the world I wouldn't do to keep him safe. Her voice cracked. I never imagined it would be the other way around. That I'd be the one who needed protecting from him. That's not a failure on your part, Robert said. That's not something you did wrong. Barbara nodded slowly, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said the words Robert had been waiting 6 weeks to hear. I'm ready to say the word. 3 days later, on a cold Tuesday morning, Robert Mitchell rode up Miller Road at the head of a procession that stretched back nearly half a mile. Not 400 riders all at once, but enough, more than enough, engines rumbling low and steady, like distant thunder rolling across the flat Missouri farmland. Officer Grant Sullivan's cruiser led the way, lights on but silent, there to ensure everything unfolded exactly within the boundaries of the law. Behind him came the paperwork Barbara had finally, courageously agreed to file. A formal police report, a sworn statement, the hospital documentation Karen had helped surface through proper legal channels, and an emergency protective order that a sympathetic judge had signed that very morning. Kevin Whitfield was standing in the driveway when they arrived, his face draining of color as engine after engine came to a stop along the quiet residential street. More bikes than Miller Road had likely seen in its entire history. "What is this?" he demanded, though the tremor in his voice suggested he already understood. Officer Sullivan stepped forward first, procedural and calm. "Kevin Whitfield, I have a protective order here, signed this morning, requiring you to vacate this residence immediately and maintain distance from Barbara Whitfield. I also have a warrant for your arrest on charges of assault, based on documented injuries and a formal statement given by the victim." Kevin's eyes darted toward the house, toward his mother, who stood on the front porch now, flanked by Diane Foster on one side, and at a respectful distance, several members of the Iron Watch. For the first time, in longer than she could remember, Barbara Whitfield did not look away from her son. She did not shrink or apologize or offer an excuse. "I'm sorry, Kevin," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I love you. I will always love you. But I can't let you hurt me anymore." Kevin's face cycled through fury, then desperation, then something that looked briefly like genuine shame. "Mom, I didn't mean—" "You broke my ribs," Barbara said simply. "Twice you've put me in that hospital, and God knows how many times you've bruised me in ways I was too ashamed to have looked at. I am done pretending this is something else." There was no violent confrontation, no dramatic struggle. Kevin Whitfield, faced with a protective order, a warrant, and the unmistakable presence of hundreds of witnesses, surrendered to Officer Sullivan without resistance, his shoulders slumped in the particular defeat of a man who has run out of lies to tell. As the cruiser pulled away with Kevin in the back seat, Barbara Whitfield stood on her porch, surrounded by strangers who had become, in the span of a few short weeks, something far closer to family than blood had ever managed to be. The months that followed were not a fairy tale. Robert Mitchell knew better than to expect one, and so did Barbara. Kevin Whitfield pled guilty to a reduced charge of domestic assault in exchange for mandatory substance abuse treatment and a lengthy probation, along with a permanent no-contact order that Barbara, after long deliberation, chose not to fight. She still loved her son, in the complicated, wounded way a mother loves a child who has hurt her. But love, she had finally come to understand, did not require her to keep offering herself up to be broken. Her physical recovery took time. The ribs healed slowly over the winter, and Karen Ellis checked in on her personally more than her professional obligations required, bringing groceries on her days off, sitting with Barbara through the long, quiet afternoons when the house felt too large and too silent without the shouting she'd somehow, impossibly, grown used to living around. But it was the Iron Watch Motorcycle Club that filled the silence in ways no one had expected. What began as a rescue became something else entirely. A genuine, unlikely friendship between an elderly widow and a brotherhood of riders who had spent most of their adult lives being misjudged by people who saw only the leather and the tattoos and never bothered to look further. Marcus Doyle took over the overgrown flower beds Barbara could no longer manage on her own, restoring them by spring into something that would have made Harold Whitfield proud. Diane Foster and Barbara resumed their Wednesday coffee visits, joined now, more often than not, by 2 or 3 club members who'd taken to stopping by simply to check in, to fix a leaky faucet, to make sure the porch light worked. Every Sunday, without fail, Robert Mitchell rode out to Miller Road before breakfast, and together he and Barbara would drive to the Crossroads Diner in his truck, taking the same booth by the window, ordering the same coffee and tea. Doris no longer needed to ask if everything was all right. She could see it plainly in the way Barbara sat now, not stiff with pain and fear, but easy, upright, present in a way she hadn't been in years. There were harder days, too, days that reminded Robert this was never going to be a story with a single clean ending. In January, a letter arrived from Kevin, written from the treatment facility where his probation had sent him, and Barbara read it alone at her kitchen table with shaking hands, unsure whether she wanted to feel hope or dread. It was an apology, imperfect, incomplete, full of excuses tangled up with genuine remorse, and Barbara sat with it for 3 days before she called Karen Ellis, not for medical advice this time, but simply because she needed someone to sit with her while she decided what, if anything, she owed a reply. "You don't owe him forgiveness on his timeline," Karen told her gently. "You get to decide what you're ready for and when. That's the whole point of everything you fought to get back." Barbara wrote back eventually, 3 sentences, careful and honest. She told him she loved him. She told him she hoped he found whatever peace he was looking for, and she told him that peace would have to be found far away from her front porch. It was not forgiveness, not yet, and perhaps not ever in the way Kevin wanted. But it was Barbara's truth, spoken in her own voice, on her own terms, and that alone felt like a victory no court order could have given her. Spring came slowly to Greene County that year, but it came. The flower beds Marcus had restored bloomed into a riot of color that drew compliments from every neighbor on Miller Road, and Barbara took to sitting on her porch in the afternoons again, something she hadn't done in years, watching the light change over a yard that finally felt like hers again. Diane joined her most days, bringing lemonade or sweet tea depending on the heat, and their old Wednesday ritual expanded into something looser and more constant, a standing invitation that half the neighborhood eventually found its way into, drawn by the warmth radiating from a house that had, for so long, kept its curtains drawn against the world. Robert never made a show of his visits. He simply kept showing up, the way he'd promised that first Sunday in the diner, and somewhere along the way, the checking in stopped feeling like a mission and started feeling like something closer to family. He fixed what needed fixing. He listened when Barbara wanted to talk about Harold, about the early years of her marriage, about a version of her life that had nothing to do with fear. And on the mornings when grief for her old life, and even for the son she'd lost to his own choices, became too heavy to carry alone, he simply sat with her in silence, the way Ellen once had for strangers in an emergency room who needed nothing more than a steady presence beside them. 6 months after that Tuesday morning on Miller Road, the Iron Watch held its annual charity ride for the local Veterans Hospital, an event that drew riders from every chapter in the region. Nearly 400 bikes lined up along the highway, engines roaring in unison as they set off. Barbara Whitfield stood at the starting line that morning, not as a bystander, but as an honorary guest, having personally sewn a small patch that now adorned the back of Robert's jacket, alongside 2 decades of others. A single embroidered rose, and beneath it 4 words she'd chosen herself. Never rode past silence. When a local news reporter, having caught wind of the story, asked Robert why an entire motorcycle club had gone to such lengths for a woman none of them had known before that October morning at the diner, he thought about the question for a long moment before answering. "People look at us and see trouble," he said. "Leather jackets, loud bikes, and they make up their minds before we've said a word. But most of us in this club, we've spent our whole lives learning what it costs when nobody stops to look closer, when nobody's willing to get involved." He glanced over at Barbara, who was laughing at something Diane had said, her face open and unguarded in a way it hadn't been in years. "She whispered 5 words to me in a diner and then asked me to forget she'd said them. I couldn't do that. Not because I'm some kind of hero, because somebody needed to stay, and I figured, why not us?" Barbara Whitfield, for her part, no longer needed to whisper anything to anyone. She had her Wednesdays with Diane, her Sundays with Robert, and a phone that rang more often now with people checking in than it ever had in the 2 years before, when her house had grown so quiet with fear that even the silence had learned to hide what was happening inside it. She had lost a son to consequences he had built entirely for himself. But in the wreckage of that loss, she had found something she never could have predicted. 400 strangers who had chosen, without hesitation, to become the family that showed up, that stayed, that never, not once, left her to face her pain alone again. On the anniversary of that first October morning, Barbara returned to the Crossroads Diner and sat once more in the corner booth. But this time, when Robert Mitchell walked through the door, she was smiling before he even reached the table, her tea already ordered, her hands steady around the warm cup, no longer trembling with anything but the simple, ordinary comfort of knowing at last that she was safe.